Alright, now it's recording. This is Mr. Lyle M. Lovell, a World War II veteran who fought in the European theater. My name is Aiden Guzak, and this is my first interview. Today is March 9th, 2019, and this is his story. Alright, go ahead.
Okay. I signed up to be an aviation cadet, and the draft board drafted me as soon as on March the 24th, and I went down to Oklahoma City and said I wanted to be an aviation cadet, and I was sent directly to San Antonio, SAC up on the hill, and my mother had a kennel, and she would melt bottles. Well, this one bottle was so large she couldn't melt it, and so
Sit still.
you go get the bottle, and so this bottle was so large, so I was out on these rocks and stuff, and got blisters on my legs, and I told them ahead of time this would happen, and so from then on that we wear long trousers instead of short trousers, so I wouldn't blister my legs. And they said we need 2 pilots to go to flight training. So I and another kid was picked, and we went immediately to flight training in Victoria, Texas. And it was real funny because we got there in Victoria, Texas, and they started hazing us, and this one pilot trainee said there's to be no hazing. they said there's to be no hazing, and I motioned the commander, who was a colonel, and I said his father is commander of the Southwest Training Command, and he says there's to be no hazing. And so they went on, and he was colorblind, and but his father said he was going through flight training, so he went through flight training, and flight training was going fine, and this one pilot was having trouble in flight training. I told him, listen, if you want to graduate, you will quit complaining and do exactly what they tell you, because they would take the stick and hit his legs and stuff, and he said, okay, Lyle. So one day we went out, and the other pilot, he crawled out of the plane and undid his harness and everything, flight suit, and just left it in the cockpit. And so when he got through chewing out the pilot, why, he told me, he said, let's take off. And So we took off and went up, and he said, do a slow roll. And I did a slow roll, and he fell out. But he grabbed the sides of the cockpit, and I completed the slow roll, and he crawled back in, and flew around, and finally, never heard a word out of the back seat. And so I went in and landed. He hopped out and disappeared. And so next day we went out, and no instructor. These were civilian instructors. And the next day, no instructor. And the colonel come out and he said, anybody know where he is? And I said, I can tell you a story about where he might be. And I told the story about him falling out, and he said, well, when he sobers up, he'll come back. And when he sobered up, he came back. So that was my story about being an instructor. And my mother didn't live to be quite 97. She was short of living for 97 years, and I always wanted to live longer than my mother. And so what? So I went ahead and I lived longer than my mother. In March the 24th, I'll be 94 years old. And if it keeps going, well, then it'll be fine. So I have pictures in the back room of my mother and the rest of my family. Mm-hmm. My older brother was crippled, and the uncle gave him a radio course, and he took the radio course and had a radio shop, and his arthritis would bother his I can't think of it. The other disease that he had, and so he battled them back and forth. And so he made a cart. He and the boy down at the blacksmith shop, they made him a cart to drive around in. And because before that, I and my little brother pushed him around in a cart. And the man that made the cart was called Lovell, and Lovell lived about 3/4 mile north of town, and he would come to town and get a bottle of whiskey, and he would drink some, and he'd give his horse some, and when they both got...
He wants to know about the war.
What?
Not your life.
Okay.
Now you can start like before you went to...
When you're flying.
First when you were drafted or did training.
Yeah. That,
Would you like to work there?
Oh no, I think you should. Yes.
There was when I was in school, there was a man was digging up rotten potatoes in his garden and throwing them on the schoolyard, there's gonna be a rotten potato fight. And I wanted to get back and do it, and I had to stay home and get the water for my mother and everything. And so I did what the chores at home and came to school, and just about the time I got to school, this guy says, "Okay, Lyle, get in line. I saw you out there." And I told him he was a liar. And headed back to town, and I met my uncle. My uncle said, "We'll go back." And so we went back, and we approached the school, and the man said, "Ha, you got brought back." And my uncle said, "We're not talking to you, you're a liar." Went up to the principal's office. He told the principal, he said, "Lyle needs a whipping because he cussed out your teacher and called him a liar." And so I got a spanking, and
Yes, I can pause it. Alright.
and I got on this boat to go overseas, and they said, "You haven't had all basic training and all this stuff." And I said, "Oh, good, then I can go back." And they said, "No, you get on the boat. We're going to England." And so we was going to England, and there was some depth charges floating in the water, and they tried to shoot them with a rifle, and they couldn't hit them. And it was a good thing, because we didn't want to explode them. And I went directly to the dock in northern England, and got off the boat, and was given an airplane, and I decided I'd do a loop, and climbed up to 40,000 feet and tried to loop it. Well, it didn't loop, and it was tumbling nose over tail, and so when it quit tumbling, then I was diving towards the ground, was pulling back on the stick as hard as I could, and come screaming down and almost to the ground, and then pulled up, and when I pulled up, I recovered and ruptured my eardrum, and so I landed, and they gave me 2 bombs, and I went to take off, and the windshield on a dirt field, the canopy flew back and hit me in the forehead, and momentarily knocked me unconscious. And I went ahead and took off and went up to Norway and dive bombed the Tripitz, which was a German battleship. And then the Tripitz went out to sea, and it went over towards Newfoundland, and it fired one shell, and it hit this English battleship, the Hood, and sank it with one shot, and split it in two, and went ahead and flew over, and we landed on the ice where some P-38s were, and then took back off and followed this English ship back towards France. And the English ship sent some torpedo bombers out and hit the rudder, and so it couldn't circulate like it wanted to. And then it went on into Brest and went into one of the harbors. And I went back and guided it and landed at the airfield, and then tried to bomb the ship in the harbor, and so then I didn't know what flak was, and then we flew into France, and the English harbor and on the Rhine River, and at the Battle of the Bulge, and I saw what flak looked like, because I was flying along at about 30,000 feet, and this shell, big 155 millimeter howitzer shell, went floating by my wingtip. Back down, and so I saw what flak was like. This one guy got hit, and he cried all the way down because he blew up.
What about your crashes?
And then we had a place. I was in the hospital for a while, and then I got put on night duty to recover. And night duty, you stayed down at group headquarters and took any calls that come in, and the call came in and said wanted to talk to the ranking officer, and so I looked around. I was the only one there, and then the door opened and Major Tyler stepped through the door, and I said, "One moment, sir, I'll get Major Tyler for you." And as I was going out, I told Major Tyler his girlfriend was on the phone, and he would say, "Kelly's Pool Hall, Kelly speaking." And as I was going out the door, I heard, "Kelly's Pool Hall, Kelly speaking." And I heard later that the general at the headquarters said, "Major, don't you realize there's a war?" And we had a place when we come back to the field that if a bomb hung up, we would go over this certain area and try to shake it loose. Well, he had a hung up bomb, and this ME-109 came in behind him and fired at him and missed him and went underneath and pulled up right in front of him, and all he had to do was pull his triggers and he shot it down. So he got credit for shooting down one airplane. But me, I went back to my group headquarters said, I need a 3-day pass. And so I got a 3-day pass, went out through the area, Mont Saint Michel and different places, and looked where the anti-aircraft guns the Germans had, how they would explode it in the gun, and so the end would split open. And and then during the Battle of the Bulge, I flew a plane, and we had a colonel that said, we're going to be known as the Orange Tails, and we was going to do wonders. So we went down, and this guy, and so there was a whole lot of goose-offs. There's 4 of us started for this English field during the Battle of the Bulge, and one of them went in the mud, got stuck, and another one went this way and got stuck, and went up and landed on this airfield, and the plane turned upside down, and the Australians come over and lifted it up, and it had just taken the top of his head off. And so
About your crashes.
that was one of the crashes. And then one day I was flying top cover, and I flew top cover 5 times, and didn't get to fire my guns, so we started home, and I cut the throttle and dropped out of formation and went back to this German airfield and started shooting German airplanes. And I didn't get any credit for shooting those German airplanes because nobody could confirm what I did. But I radioed back in and said, I'm coming back in, direct me to where, back to the airfield. And they were directing me back to the airfield and was letting me down, and they said, pull up, you're in the wrong place. I said, no, I know where I am. I said, I'll land. And I went in and landed, and they said, what happened? Said, everybody else was shot down or ran out of fuel, and you're coming in with your guns empty and safely and ahead of everybody. And so there's a lot of wild stories. And then one day we had the day off, and I had this other kid was going to fly up to Germany and see what we could do. And we flew into Germany, and we found us a target, and he didn't fire his guns. And I thought, he didn't fire his guns, so I'm not going to fire my guns. You know, I don't know what's going on. And we started back, and I called him. I said, what's wrong? He said, my guns won't work. And so we went back to our airfield and landed, and they forgot to charge the guns, so he couldn't have fired. His guns wouldn't fire for him. So we went back. One mess to another, and well,
What about your crashes?
oh,
It's okay.
the last time I crashed, I was going to. There was two trains coming together, and I dropped a bomb so that it would blow up between the trains and the trains would crash. And when I pulled up, I looked over and saw a German airfield, and I went over and I strafed the German airfield, and this plane caught on fire, and was burning, and I was killed a lot of people. And so I pulled up into the sun and came back and dove back on the airfield because I was going to shoot some more. And halfway across the airfield, I realized the engine wasn't running anymore. And so got to the end of the airfield and pulled up and got up to 1,000 feet, and the plane started running. And then I dropped the nose and it quit running. So I crashed in the ground, and I couldn't. The only thing I could see was the sun and the burning airplane. That's the only thing I could see. So I went over and said, "God help me," and I walked over and sat down on the ground and put my hands across my knees, and I could feel my fingers dripping. And said, "Well, I'm not going to run off and do anything." And about that time, they shot down a ME-109 right in the same field where I was shot at. And then they hauled me up to this German hospital, put me in the hospital, and they unwrapped my burns and put paper bandages on them. Cut the blisters off and put paper bandages on them. And I could look out the window and see the guys, my group, dive bombing the railroad track out the window. And but I couldn't do anything because I was there with my hands burnt. And they said the Americans would pick me up in 5 days. Well, it was 11 days before the Americans picked me up. And this colonel of the artillery came in, and he said, "Are there any other Americans in this hospital?" And I said, "Not that I know of." And he said, "Well, I can't find anybody that could talk English." I said, "That's surprising. Those two doctors standing right beside you have been talking English with me for days." They started talking right fast, And he said, "I'll leave my sergeant with you." And the sergeant had a submachine gun, hand grenades hanging off of all his pockets. And he said, "You want one of these nurses?" I said, "You can have one if you want." I said, "I don't know what I'd do with it. I can't do anything." And so then I made a mistake because I watched them. They said, "Well, you need a penicillin shot." And I said, "No, I don't." I said, "Other people need it worse than I do." And I watched them go down because I watched them go down into one guy and give him a penicillin shot. And I decided I didn't want them doing that to me. And so I finally told the nurse I needed a bottle of can't think of it. But anyway, I needed a bottle, and she gave it to me to drink, and I drank it, and I had a bowel movement, and I thought I was going to die. So I'm laying there in this German hospital, and we had a doctor that thought they was changing bandages too often. So this general came in with a real pretty nurse, and he said, "Who stinks in here?" I pointed to the guy beside me. He'd been shot through the leg. Said, "He stinks worse than I do." And so they took him out and cleaned him up and brought him back, and then they took me out, and the doctor uncovered this hand, and it was fine. And then he uncovered this hand, and it was white with infection. And just pure infection. And and I passed out. And he cleaned it up, and he come back and he said, he was standing there at the foot of the bed and said, "Here's my number in this hospital. If there's something you don't like, you call this number and I'll take care of it." And so I'm laying there in this hospital bed and with that number, and they came in and they said, "We want this room spotless." And when they came in the morning, so I got all the nurses and everybody, and I said, "Can you get 4 traction beds just like those?" And they said, "Yes." I said, "Okay, wheel everybody out behind the building and put those traction beds in their place." And the next morning, the colonel and the major and the captain came in and said, "What is going on?" I said, "You ordered this place spotless, and it is." And they took one look. They put me on the next C-54 transport for the States. And I wasn't supposed to be on it. So we got on the plane, went down to the Azores, and started a flight, and the engines were bad, so they brought it back, and overhauled the engines, and we started out again for LaGuardia. And I asked them if we could come up in the cockpit and look around, and they said no. And so I told everybody to, when they got up to altitude, walk to the back of the plane and they'd start climbing. And so they would let it climb up and they'd level it off again. And then I said, everybody walk to the front of the plane and start diving. And so in a little while they said, would you all like to come up and look around the cockpit? Said, sure would. So they let us go up and let me go up and look around the cockpit. And we landed at LaGuardia in New York. And I'm there in bed, and I called my mother and said, I'm here in New York City at LaGuardia Airfield. And she said, no. And I said, no, this is Lyle. Well, Noel was, my brother, was coming into San Francisco, and he'd lost a kidney. So he went to San Antonio to the hospital, and I went to Springfield, Missouri, and was being treated, and they had me drink 2 bottles of beer before breakfast each morning to gain my weight back. And so I was drinking beer, and then I got transferred from there to Tinker Field and Air Base, and I went to Tinker Field Air Base and was given an assignment. I had 40 warehouses of surplus material and 40 acres of surplus material. And I was doing fine because I had a safe in my office, and if somebody come in and wanted a pair of sunglasses or wristwatch or something that they weren't authorized to have, I would look in my safe, and if I had them in the safe, I would give them what they weren't authorized to have, and I'd put theirs in the safe. And things were going fine. And then one day I got an order to send 5 Norden bomb sites to salvage. I knew that was wrong because you weren't supposed to do that. And so I sent them to salvage, just like they said, because what they were doing, they were letting people look at the bids and things that went to salvage, and if their buddy had a lower bid, they would reject that bid and take the lower bid. And so The door came open and these two guys come in that looked like college kids. And they said they wanted to see the order I had for sending the northern bomb sites to salvage. I said, oh, I said, I got it in my safe. And I opened the safe and took it out. And they said, we'll take it. I said, no, you won't. I said, this is the only evidence I have did. And they said, okay. And so the northern bomb sites were brought back to stock, and they took my safe away from me and sent me to and I thought I needed skin grafts, so I wouldn't get out, so I went to Arizona and started flying again. And from there I went to Okinawa. So,
That's your story.
and that's pretty well the story.
Okay, can you talk about maybe 3 of your missions when you were flying? Like maybe the turrets to the camera?
3 of my missions?
Yes.
Well, the first mission was to dive bomb the triples. And,
That was your first one you did?
yeah. Okay. And then, there was another mission. Oh, another mission I had was to dive bomb a flak position up along the Rhine River. And what I had was three clusters of fragmentation bombs under each wing and the belly. And every time you'd hear an air pocket, you'd hear them clank together. And I was to drop them on this position ahead of the bombers, so that the bombers would have a better chance of going. And so I dropped them, but then I got shot in the engine, and the airplane was on fire. So I stood out on the wing and pulled out this strap and hooked my harness in the strap, and reached in and was flying the plane, and the fire went out. So then I went straight ahead, and oil was going all over the windshield and everything, and I told my wingman that I was going to land and on the airfield that I saw right ahead of me. And instead of him telling me to go straight ahead, he let me turn back into the hill, and I crashed and come down the side of the hill, and the left wing was tore off. The right wing cut out a tree, and I slid up on this bridge, and gasoline is running out all over the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
There was a guy in the foxhole, and he crawled out of the foxhole and said, boy, you'd never get me in one of those. And I looked at him, and there was ice and water dropping off of it. I said, you'd never get me in one of those. About that time, this Jeep roared down the hill and picked us up, and roared back up the hill, and they said everything's set with dynamite, so if the Germans start coming, they could blow the bridge. And so I went back to my division, and that's when I got put in the hospital the first time.
Okay. Were you a part of the Normandy invasions or no?
Well, no. I came in towards the end on a C-54 transport cargo, and was dropped off at this airfield towards the end of, what was the date? Anyway, towards the end of March.
Okay. Where were you when Pearl Harbor happened?
Where was I in Pearl Harbor?
When it happened, yes.
Where was I? I was across the street at the neighbors. And I heard about it. Yeah, I was across the street at the neighbors, and I heard about Pearl Harbor, and I thought, oh, it'll be over before I get a chance to get in. But it turned out it was a long time for it. And I went to the South Pacific and was on a oil tanker that was floating in the water, and it needed to go back up to, and so the aircraft carrier had been hit that the oil tanker was supposed to supply, and so we got oil in the oil tanker to the carrier and went back to Pearl Harbor, and got back to Pearl Harbor, and civilian crew came on board to repair the ship, and then we were supposed to go up to Alaska, and we sailed up to Alaska, and the civilians were still on board, and we then sank some Japanese ships, and then they came back, and they were going to sink the German aircraft carriers, and the planes they sent out against them showed where they were, and they were able to sink those aircraft carriers, because the aircraft carriers, the Japanese aircraft carriers were switching, reloading, and bombers came in and blew them out of the water.
Can you tell me about when you experienced the Messerschmitt ME-262?
When I experienced it,
Yes, for the video.
okay, I'd taken off and we were with Patch's 3rd Army, and we had run out of ammunition. So we had depth charges, and we came over the city and dropped the depth charges. And when I pulled off from the depth charges, why, there was an ME-262, and I was going to fire at it, but I was afraid of hitting one of my own planes, so I didn't shoot. And that's the first time I run into an ME-262.
How fast were they against your plane?
How fast? Oh, they were fast. Yeah. They were real fast.
So what is your total number of missions?
My total number of missions?
Yes, you did. Yes.
I have no idea.
It's alright, if you don't know.
Yeah. Well, wait a minute. At one time, I had, what was it? I had 16 air medals and 5 Purple Hearts.
Wow. Did you get any war relics, like medals from maybe like taken German medals, or no?
No.
Okay.
What? I said 5 Purple Hearts.
It says on your paper in the order of Purple Heart. Purple Heart.
Yeah.
Did you ever run into the F-190s, FW-190s, German fighter planes?
Yeah.
How many times did you see them when you were in the air?
How many times? Just the one time. Well, and then in the South Pacific, I ran into them after the war.
Okay. Now, what were some of your missions during the Bulge? The Battle of the Bulge?
The Battle of the Bulge?
Yeah, if you name a couple.
Sure, during the Battle of the Bulge, we went in and the guys took off and we went out and we met this group of German fighters coming in. And we shot them down, and the ones we didn't shoot down went out to sea and come back into Holland, and their own gunner shot them down the German planes.
Did you, when you were flying, did you ever see any V-1 rockets, or no?
V-1 rockets, yeah. Well,
What was the closest encounter with one of those to your plane?
the V-1 rockets, let's see. We would tilt the wing,
Yeah.
and get them off course,
Mm-hmm.
and then they'd go in.
what were some of your bombs? Were they 50 kilogram?
What?
How much did your bombs weigh?
Well, it varied. The bombs depending on what type of mission you was going on.
Mm-hmm.
They would go from 500 pound to 1,000 pound to less than that.
Okay. Were you in Remagen when the Allies crossed the bridge over the Rhine?
Where was I? I was with Patton's 3rd Army when they crossed over the Rhine. Yeah.
Did you encounter anti-aircraft fire near? Well, the 74th anniversary of that bridge crossing was 2 days ago.
Yeah.
And I did a little information on my phone. Was the Ardennes forest covered in snow when you were fighting?
Yeah. No, there was a lot of snow. Yeah. And we were going in, and the bad part of the thing was we were going up to this fuel depot.
Mm-hmm.
And the Germans was trying to get to the fuel depot so they could refuel their tanks and stuff. And so we let the oil and stuff run back down the road and set the tanks on fire.
Did you ever get any machine gun fire from any of the German tanks while you were flying, or no?
Yeah. But the main thing, to shoot at a German tank, you would come in behind and shoot at the ground and let your bullets bounce up into the bottom of the tank.
Yeah. Which parts of northern France were you in?
Which parts of northern France?
Yes.
Well, I was all over.
But you didn't see, like, the Normandy beach?
Well, the Normandy?
Yes.
Yeah, I wasn't in on that because I didn't come in till later.
You were commissioned to a fighter pilot February 8th, 1944? Is that
Mm-hmm.
correct? So that's when you went in?
No, I was commissioned to a fighter pilot on November the 8th when I came home on leave.
Oh, okay.
I came home on leave and had a picture behind my mother.
Mm-hmm.
And then that was it.
Did you have any escort missions to protect the bombers?
Yep. Yeah. We would fly for B-24s and for B-29s. I mean, A-29s.
Oh, B-29s. I don't think I've ever heard that one. Well, did you ever escort the B-17? The Flying Fortress?
Yep. Yeah, there's one went out into the African desert, you know.
Yeah, I saw that. What Air Force were you in? Were you in like a number Air Force? Like, I'm just going to example the 8th Air Force, or
it varied. The Air Forces that I were in was the 1st Air Force. That was back here in training in the States. And then I went to the 8th Air Force. Then I went to the 7th Air Force. And so there was a bunch of them.
But were you mainly in the 8th Air Force? Or which Air Force did you do the most missions in?
8th Air Force.
Okay. Do you know your fighter squadron? Or were you a part of a squadron of fighters?
Yeah, 358th Fighter Squadron.
Did you...
Which later became the Indiana Air National Guard.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't think I have any more questions. I think this interview is over with.
Okay.
If you'd like to say anything to the camera before we end this.